Welcome back to Drilled. I'm Amy Westervelt. Today I'm bringing you an episode of one of my favorite climate podcasts, Outrage and Optimism, where every week they examine issues at the forefront of the climate crisis, interview changemakers, and transform anger into productive dialogue about building a sustainable future. It's hosted by Christiana Figueres, Tom Rivett-Carnac, and Paul Dickinson. And then usually they'll have a guest on as well. Today we're bringing you an episode entitled How to Talk About Climate Change So People Will Listen. It's an interview with communications expert John Marshall, CEO of Potential Energy Coalition, to talk about climate change's marketing problem and how to solve it. It's essential listening for anyone who wants to understand how to communicate about this massive crisis. Check it out. I think you'll like it.
Welcome to Outrage and Optimism. I'm Tom Rivett-Carnac.
I'm Christiana Figueres.
And I'm Paul Dickinson.
And hello to listeners to Drilled. We are recording this to introduce you to Outrage and Optimism. Thanks for being here. So, friends, we are now doing this very exciting feed drop with Amy Westervelt and our friends at Drilled, and we are now have an interesting and exciting task ahead of us. But first of all, which of you wants to tell listeners to Drilled what Outrage and Optimism is all about?
Christiana.
Paul wants to do that.
Outrage and Optimism is, just as in the title, it's an opportunity for us to understand the things that drive us crazy about climate change and make us concerned.
You don't need to go into your sort of English gentleman mode when doing this. I've just a flag.
I don't need to be interrupted by you when I was just like getting in the flow. We are able to express and communicate and hold and be with the outrage that you cannot be involved seriously in climate change and not feel outraged, but not end up in the rabbit and headlights unfortunate position of not knowing what on earth is going on, but instead move through that to the optimism. And boy, have we had some incredibly optimistic, positive, and brilliant people, which brings us on to the question, like, who do we choose for this Drilled podcast? There are all these thousands of new friends from Drilled.
Well, first of all, Christiana, what do you think? Is that a good nailing of what Outrage and Optimism is?
Yeah, I think that's a very important aspect to really be able to balance the anger, the grief, the pain of what we have not done and what we have lost with the excitement of what is going on and the ambition and the vision of what can be. So yes, the balancing of that is very important. But the other thing that I think that we do, and I put it to you to react and tell me whether you think this is true. I think that despite the fact that the three of us are climate wonks, I think we do a pretty good job at putting out the information, the news, the analysis in ways that are very understandable to everyone. We really try to stay away from acronyms and weirdo language and just make it very accessible and fun. That's probably the most important.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we first started this journey, we kind of realized that there's an increasing number of people that are really concerned about what's happening, right? This sense of anxiety is rising as the impacts get worse. But we're not prepared to give up yet. So where do we put our trust? Where do we double down? What action do we take?
Like, what's the point where we're going to give up episode at some point?
We're not prepared to give up at all. So what this podcast tries to do is help people understand where we are, how we can not give up, how we can dig in and really make a difference. And that actually brings us to an interesting task we have ahead of us. So Drilled have invited us to do this feed swap, and we have to select an episode that the listeners to Drilled are now going to get to hear. So what do you think? Which of our episodes from the 3 years we've been on air should we offer to Drilled for them to put out?
Well, Paul, which have been like our most distinguished guests?
Let me see.
Give us a short
Kingsmill
list.
Bonn from the Rocky Mountain Institute was very distinguished. Not just his just extraordinary name, Kingsmill Bond. But no, I liked, because we've been doing this for a few years. So we spoke to the Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May. Do you remember that? That was fun. We just spoke the other week to Al Gore, he's so powerful. What is it? He said, I'm pressing my own button on this one. And he's kind of filled up the microphone. it was amazing to speak to Greta Thunberg or David Attenborough or the brilliant musician Aurora. Do you remember we had a Massive Attack on, and they actually made a mix of you, Christiana, speaking, which is pretty cool. John Kerry is great. We had like the chief executive of Shell, and then everybody thought that we were very bad and did the interview wrong. And we had the chief executive of Greenpeace came here and told us how badly we interviewed the chief executive of Shell. So those are the ones that spring to mind. But there's so many others, like brilliant people.
So it's going to be a difficult choice. But let's think about the listeners to Drilled. What are they most interested in? Because that's the way that we should choose.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, that's probably more to do with like, how do we tell the story around climate? And we should get to that. I have to say some of the other ones that I've really enjoyed that I would just put forward is like, the three of us often end up going to the COP negotiations or to the World Economic Forum or to New York Climate Week. And we sit up late at night after these negotiations and kind of reflect what's been going on and share the inside story. So those, even though they've been like the three of us, like having a drink late at night, those have been some of the most fun times.
Are you saying that we're the best people who've been on our podcast? Well, of course I agree, but it's a little bit self-serving saying that.
But what about, Christiana, what do you think?
Well, I think it should be about storytelling, about the challenges that we're having. Everyone in the climate community is really, really challenged, but how do we tell stories that seem very contradictory? The one story, of course, is the terrible impacts of climate change that we have been witnessing, especially this summer, the summer from hell. But the other story is the very, very exciting progress, in fact, exponential progress that we're seeing on the technology side, on the solution side. But storytelling is so important because it really determines the way you think and eventually the way you act. So that is where transformation starts, is in storytelling and what we tell ourselves, what is in our head. So from that perspective, I would say John Marshall.
John Marshall. John is such a star. So I think that's a really good idea. Paul, are you agreed?
Yeah, I mean, I do really like Jane Fonda or Noah Yuval Harari, who's been twice on the podcast. I could go on, but you're right. In terms of comms, John Marshall is the world expert.
So, listeners to Drilled, I think that's a decision. So we are going to play that episode. We introduced John during this conversation. So even if you don't know who he is, before his interview comes on in a few minutes, we will provide the introduction. This episode we put out, it's now early October. We put it out a couple of months ago. So some elements of the chat may be a bit dated. I was just in New York for the UN General Assembly week, and I got a chance to catch up with John. And actually, the work he's done even since we did this interview has been really remarkable in terms of assessing everybody in the G20, large numbers of people in the G20 to look at really what are the main drivers that can precipitate climate action. How do we, in the US in particular, invest thoughtful, strategic money to actually move voters to get them to vote on climate as an issue? That's something he talks about in this episode. So I think this is a great choice, Christiana. Let's go now to that episode. And listeners to Drilled, we're thrilled to meet you. So hope you like Outrage and Optimism, and see you soon.
Hello, see you again. Bye.
Bye, join us.
Hello and welcome to Outrage and Optimism. I'm Tom Rivett-Carnac.
I'm Christiana Figueres.
And I'm Paul Dickinson.
This week, we talk about what happened in Bonn at the negotiations. We look forward to the finance summit in Paris. We speak to John Marshall, CEO of Potential Energy, and we have music from Hazel May. Thanks for being here. So it's good to see you both, and I'm going to see you in person next week, Christiana, which is very exciting. I am on my way to London. I know, Paul. I'm sad you're not going to be there, unless
Why
you
am
are.
I not going to be there?
Bonn Village in France next week?
I'm not going to be there, no.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll catch you anyway. Yeah, we'll wish you were too. I'm on my way at the moment to Global Citizen Festival in Paris on Thursday. I know you're on your way to London, Christiana. We've got various meetings lined up, and then Plum Village next week. So looking forward to seeing you all. But for now, I wonder if we should start by just diving in to the negotiations that just finished in Bonn. These are the intersessional negotiations that happened between the COPs, but they do very much set the agenda for what's to come. And we're now halfway towards the much anticipated COP28 in the UAE. Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, the incoming president, beleaguered incoming president, we might say, was there. And I think there were lots of signs all over Bonn. Christiana, you sent me some that you received. Continuing to repeat the phrase that we need to get oil out of the negotiations. This is the narrative that is really building. But I think that the SBs themselves, the negotiations, were regarded as a mixed success, to say the least. Christiana, do you want to kick off? What's your impression of what just happened in Bonn?
Well, I'm thrilled to hear you say that it's a mixed report, Tom.
At best, I said.
The famous curate's egg. Have you ever heard that story of the curate's egg? Like this junior person goes to the kind of boss's house, and some interesting gets this served a bad egg, which is inedible, basically. And the host says, "How is it?" And he said, "Good in parts."
Exactly.
Good in parts.
Good in parts. So, Tom, I don't know if you had joined us by this time or not, but I do remember one of these subsidiary meetings in which it took parties 2 days to agree to an agenda, and I remember how the press was. That. Oh, you were there. Okay, good. So I remember how the press was just in total disbelief. How can it take 2 days to agree to an agenda? Well, an agenda is actually pretty important to agree on in these multilateral negotiations because it determines what, how much time is going to be spent on each topic. And so I was actually what should I say, wounded, and I carry still a scar from those SBs where it took us 2 days to agree an agenda. But at this SB, they agreed the agenda 1 day before closing.
And SB, just for people, a subsidiary body, right? Which is the meeting that is the title of this 2-week meeting. Right?
Yes, thank you. These are the sort of the inter-sessional meetings between COPs. And the one in Bonn just finished.
And they agreed the agenda the day before they left?
The day before they left.
How many day meeting?
2 weeks.
So they spent essentially 13 or 14 days deciding the agenda.
No, they actually went into topics without an agreed agenda, but had they not agreed an agenda, then nothing that they had discussed would have had any legal value. The fact is that very little of what came out has any legal value or any legal value add, I should say, because most of the items were simply procedural decisions that you, Paul, and you, Tom, will remember, which is the kind of language that you throw into a document when there's absolutely no way forward. And basically the procedural decision says, and parties shall continue to discuss.
Agreement to agree in the future. Right.
Yeah. So I'm actually, I'm quite despondent about these last 2 weeks. But Tom, you said, well, how did you paint it?
Good in parts. Mixed success.
Okay. Well, where's the good part?
Yeah, what's the good part? Which part of the egg are you going to eat, Tom?
I actually don't have an answer to that. And the reports I received were quite concerning for the reasons you described, as well as other things. So one thing that struck out to me was that the Secretariat, the UNFCCC, has taken on very much its responsibility to try to track and police net zero targets. We've talked a lot on this podcast about this sort of concern about, is there greenwashing? And there was the UNS Secretary General's high-level expert group on what does a good disclosure look like and who should be tracking.
Led by the brilliant Catherine McKenna.
Led by the brilliant Catherine McKenna, who came on the podcast and talked about it. And the UNFCCC Executive Secretary, Simon Steele, ran a session where he talked about the role that the UNFCCC was now going to play. And multiple people who were in the room were messaging me saying, the parties are not accepting this. Everybody is saying, you've blindsided us. This is overreach of your role. We don't want you doing this in different kind of
doing
language.
What, roughly?
Well, they're setting themselves up as the place that sets the standards and that manages the disclosure process, potentially, of all of the non-state actors out in the world.
Manages the disclosure process of the non-state actors. Yeah, interesting. I might know a thing or two about that myself, actually.
I think you do. So I think it's just the UNFCCC is such an important institution. It needs to be able to like bring parties with it to do big and important things. And I think the readout I received, and we should maybe get Simon back to talk about it, is that it was, at best good in parts, but there was a lot of pushback and a lot of we don't think this is the role for you. So that confuses the role of the Secretariat, the UN Climate Secretariat, at a really critical moment in terms of what is their role around all these issues, now that many issues that were under negotiation before have been resolved and we're moving to implementation.
Well, just a thought. I think the United Nations is an invitation, and like every other right-thinking person I know, I accept the invitation, and I think it's absolutely right and proper that we all do all we can to support Simon Steele and the Secretariat
100%.
to achieve their goals. And I'm upset to hear about this hiccup. Let's hope it is a hiccup, although it sounds like a pretty big hiccup.
Yes. Well, watch this space. There'll be more to come. I do think on brighter note, I think and you circulated, Christiana, Dr. Sultan's speech, which seemed a lot better than the ones he's given before.
Yes. Yes, the speech that he held in Bonn was clearly the result of deeper listening and I think shows a very steep learning curve in what the role of the COP president is. So I was actually quite delighted to read that and to see definite improvement there.
Can I ask a question? I mean, I think that the role of the UNFCCC in terms of supporting the global stocktake and the role of non-state actors is absolutely critical, and we should be very supportive of that. The COPs are in themselves very important because the world's attention is really focused. But is it possibly the case that climate change is really moving towards more now of a kind of national issue, and it's about how nations and national governments are responding, and that there's less of necessarily an international character to it? That is to say that would we not think that maybe this is the time when the rubber hits the road and how nations individually are responding, and in groups like the EU starts to become increasingly important?
Well, I mean, one thing that tees us up nicely maybe for the next topic, which is one area where that is absolutely not the case, is around financing. So we actually do need a lot of international agreement to ensure that the appropriate financing can be put in place to support developing countries, emerging economies, to make these kinds of transitions. This is an issue, as we've said many times, that many of them have done little to cause, and yet they're suffering the worst impacts. And as we know from previous conversations with people like Avinash Prasad, countries are paying very significantly more to borrow money to invest in infrastructure projects to try and transform their economies. And that makes it very unprofitable for them, often, to invest in renewable energy projects, to invest in adaptation projects. And that's something that this summit that's taking place this week in Paris, the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, is going to try to deal with. Should we go there, or anything else to say about the SBs?
Well, and the other thing that is related to that, Tom, is this new World Bank report that comes out and says,
Right.
we are wasting trillions of dollars subsidizing fossil fuels, subsidizing farming, subsidizing fishing, all of which are causing, quote unquote, environmental havoc. And many of these countries that are doing that are actually developing countries, spending so much money on harmful subsidies than they do on health, on education, on poverty reduction. And if these countries were to reform those subsidies, reduce those subsidies, there would be quite a bit of funding available to address climate change, to address biodiversity, to address, the pressing issues. So these are really toxic subsidies that are sort of a leftover from last century, where it was perhaps important to subsidize fossil fuels so that a majority of people could have access, but that is not so anymore. That report says that we collectively are subsidizing to the tune of $7 trillion a year. So let's rebrand that not as subsidy, but as an investment into our own destruction.
Terrible, unbelievably terrible. And it does come a little bit to that issue of get oil out of the negotiations. Now, Clearly, we know that the UAE is in a very sort of unique position because the economy is very much based on fossil fuels. Just parking the UAE presidency for a minute and the extraordinary position of Dr. Sultan, I think that there is something very strange. I mentioned this before about in last week, I think it was, about the Tobacco Industry Convention, this UN convention signed by 168 countries that says, in setting and implementing their public health policies with respect to tobacco control, parties shall act to protect these policies from commercial and other vested interests of the tobacco industry in accordance with national law. And Christiana, you pointed out in response to me that there isn't really a sort of, tobacco is meant to end. And we were talking a little bit about the notion of, energy companies being welcome, but fossil fuel companies not being welcome. And I mention this specifically because what is the definition of a fossil fuel company? And I think the definition, if I might give it to you, is from Shell, the new Shell. The new CEO just gave a speech in New York, I think just this week. The chief executive, Wael Sawan, said he sought to increase investor confidence with the promise of, and this is a quote, ruthless focus on financial performance. Spending 10 to 15 billion over the next 3 years on low carbon energy sounds good, doesn't it? But 40 billion over the same period to spend on oil and gas production. And here again, I'm quoting him. He says, ultimately, what we need to do is to be able to generate long-term value for our shareholders. The answer cannot be, I'm going to invest in clean energy projects and have poor returns, and that's going to vindicate my conscience. That's wrong, he said. So the question really is he a kind of monster, or is he doing what he's been set up to do, which is be put in there by shareholders who want higher returns? And isn't it really our responsibility to change the laws so he doesn't get higher returns from putting more money in fossil fuels? Is he to blame for this, or are we to blame because we're not good enough at changing our national laws so he doesn't make money by doing the wrong thing?
Sorry, Paul, but I am certainly not going to take responsibility for that speech or what it represents. I'm sorry. We're all adults. We all have climate information in front of us. I don't think that you can exempt the CEO of a major oil and gas company from any responsibility because our national regulation is not sharp enough yet. That does not excuse him.
Good, clear answer.
Yeah, and you can't just say my only responsibility is to make every decision to maximize return at this moment, and I don't care about anything else. I mean, that is a form of capitalism that we know has created innumerable problems. Of course, nobody's saying that Shell should run itself into the ground and lose all its money, and there needs to be a pathway to transition that is profitable and brings the shareholders with them. But to say, I have no responsibility for that, I'm just going to make money, and unless the laws are changed, I'm not doing anything, is wildly irresponsible.
But how many listeners to this podcast have got some sorts of investments where their investment managers selected him as the next chief executive of Shell because he was willing to say these things and act in this way? I agree. Of course, I agree with you, Christiana, but I think the culpability does lie with us to some degree. He was selected to close the gap between the valuations of the US oil and gas companies and the European ones. And he's talking about being, what was his stupid word he used? About being ruthless. And not being about, what was it? Trying to sort of absolve the consciousness. I mean, it's a connected point. So there's more to say about this, but on financing.
So Paul, we're gonna have to move on, unfortunately, to our guest. I mean, it's an interesting point, and it's one we should get into. It's one we're all very familiar with as well. But to claim, I don't have responsibility, I'm just meeting the needs of my shareholders, everything else can go hang, I don't care about anything else, is wildly irresponsible. There's absolutely no other way to look at it like that. And history will judge that incredibly hard.
I agree with that, but we've got to own this system because we're in it.
I think everybody has to have responsibility for taking us to where we need to go. And if we say it's our responsibility or their responsibility or someone else, the buck just continues to be passed, right? That's where we've been for a long time.
The secret is good communications. Now, who knows about that?
Now, yes, very good point. So we're going to get John Marshall in a minute. Just very quickly before we do, I mentioned earlier that there's a big summit this week in Paris. I'm sure many listeners listeners know about it, the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact that's been pulled together by Emmanuel Macron and Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados and President of France. And it's going to be an interesting moment. There has been this set of ideas called the Bridgetown Initiative, which is an attempt to review and reform international finance. We don't have time to get into it now, but I think after the summit, we will invite someone deeply involved to come back and report on what happened and have we really moved forward. Now, John Marshall, who we're going to let into the call in just 1 second, is a completely brilliant individual who I've known, we've all known for a number of years. He's the CEO and founder of the Potential Energy Coalition, which is a non-partisan, non-profit coalition that brings together the leading creative, analytic, and media agencies in the US to shift the conversation on climate change. John Marshall knows more than pretty much anyone else about how do you develop new narratives that help people understand the issue and engage audience on a personal level and build demand for a better world. So, hey, John.
Nice to be with you.
John, so thank you so much for joining us here on Outrage and Optimism. We're so excited to have you. John, I actually can't believe that we hadn't had you before. This is really odd.
I was appalled to realize we haven't had him on
before. Odd, because here we are.
Enormous mistake.
Here we are thinking that we're communicating on climate change, and we haven't had the number one top expert. So let this be a public sign of contrition, John. So we're repairing that damage today. John, is it possible for you, before we jump into the here and now, which is highly complex, is it possible for you to give us a little historical overview of, you have been in this field of communicating on climate change for decades. Would you be able to give us a little general overview on how it has changed since you have been leading this field? Where were we several decades ago as opposed to where we are now? And what have been the factors that have led for that evolution?
Yeah, great question. Well, actually, I've been thinking about it for decades. Potential Energy has been in business for, I guess, our 4th anniversary is coming up in the next couple of weeks. Thanks to my 17-year-old locking me in the house one weekend and telling me I needed to do something with my life. So my
Yay!
Good job, 17-year-old. That's excellent.
Yeah.
Use climate action.
Yeah.
Get dad.
my past life was selling credit cards and soap, and so he said, you got to try and sell something that matters. So I think we still have a challenge in front of us, to be honest. I guess my observation would be, we've had a lot of solutions. We've had great policies. We've undersold those in the last couple of decades. I think that seems to be changing. I think we've now, the policy world is catching up to things that we've actually made some more progress on in the last few years. But I guess I would say we still have a long way to go with the general public. So I'm going to start with my outrage story. I'll get to my optimism story. But
Okay.
we have under-communicated, to your average person. And so I think the reason that we started Potential Energy was to find a way for us to be an accelerant. There's been a gradual increase in salience of the issue, but in terms of urgency of the issue, the number of people globally who say this must be our top priority, we still need to gain ourselves another 10 points really fast. To do that. We're somewhere between 30 and 40% globally in terms of this being a high priority issue, a very high priority issue when it should be the highest priority issue. And so my perspective is a long way to go still.
But John, 30 to 40, if that's where we are right now, that's actually an improvement from where we were 10 or 20 years ago, are we not? Or in fact, 30 years ago or 40 when I started this.
Yeah. I did an interesting analysis on a whole bunch of different countries and where they are in terms of overall salience of the issue and tried to correlate that to strength of climate policy. And the higher correlation is actually to polarization. And so the gap between one extreme and another extreme is more correlated than the overall level. So if you look at the UK, you've got a 14-point gap between Labour and Conservatives in terms of how important is the issue. And in the US, you have a 59-point gap.
Wow.
And you see these big gaps in Australia, you see them in the US, you see them in South Africa and other countries. That tends to be a bigger driver of support for policy than even the absolute level. You see the absolute levels in different countries are actually fairly similar, but the degree of difference in some is fairly high. So we've been trying to crack this tough puzzle of how do you get everybody to care rather than how do you get a smaller group of people to care. And a lot of that is about a rebrand in a way. And I'm not necessarily saying we don't use the term climate change. That's a big brand. It's a brand that exists. I'm sad that we called it climate change because it's not the best brand. It doesn't necessarily mean that much, but a brand is kind of the sum of imagery that you think about when you think about a problem. And so to move the climate change brand to the relevance today, as opposed to a more abstract idea is a pretty big motivator.
Wow. So two things come up for me right away. So what is the brand, John Marshall? What is the new name? And the other that comes up from the data that you pointed out, the difference between the USA, Australia, and EU, it's because of the politicization in addition to the polarization. It's because of the political parties, right? Because we have somehow aligned issues with a political party, a political agenda. And so my question to you is that where climate change ought to be, aligned with a political agenda? Or how do we rescue climate change out of this political nightmare? Because as far as I can tell, climate affects all political parties equally in each country.
Well, the good news is that it's doable. And, we see from our data, you really can move everybody. It's kind of simple in a way. It's about understanding who they are, what they care about, and what they want and what they might miss. Yeah. And relating to folks. To your first question about the brand of climate change, I think it's the surrounding attributes that are the challenge, maybe not so much the brand. No one wakes up in the morning and says, what a great day for some decarbonization. And those of us in the climate elite are this is a smart crowd, right? Like the smart crowd of people listening to this podcast. And they understand the concepts of net zero in 2040 at 1.5 degrees and decarbonization and methane and anthropogenic and all that stuff. But that's not how regular people think about the world. And so we got a bubble problem on our hands. We've had a big miss with our terms, with our language, with our goals. And I kind of wish that marketers were brought in earlier, I guess would be my thought. Like you think about the framing of net zero. People are starting to understand it, but we lost a lot of ground because it's not necessarily an intuitive idea, and no one wants to go to zero. It's not like a place that I want to go to. Why do we even have a word net? So I think in terms of the attributes of the brand, we need to humanize the way we talk about this, and we need to simplify it. We kind of have three tenets that we're using, which is simplicity, humanity, and accountability. So in simplicity, we just need to scrap all those words and start talking regular speak. In humanity, and I think this does get to a way to connect everybody. We have definitely found that the messages that work the best are have a person in it, have a person like me, and talk about how that person is being affected. We did a little A/B test where we had a message that a lot of climate philanthropists really like, which is a conceptual message. Look at our opportunity for economic advantage and competitive advantage and job gains and all the conceptual stuff. And then you just have another message with a mom talking about her kid. The second message outperforms the first by a factor of 4 to 1. And so when we start to humanize the conversation and take it out of the conceptual terms where it's been for a long time, we get a lot of effectiveness. But the last thing is about the rebrand. I don't think the concept of fighting climate change means that much to people. I mean, people don't really understand it that well. I think the right rebrand is to fight the pollution that's causing climate change, or fight the polluters who are causing climate change. Because we can fight a polluter or we can fight pollution. That's a very identifiable thing in somebody's mind. But it's really hard to fight an abstract concept that most people think is caused by recycling and plastics and ozone holes. And it's just not a very specific idea. So probably the biggest part of the rebrand to your question is to make this a pollution issue, particularly in the global south as well, where air pollution is just such a scourge, and really make that the rallying cry of ending the pollution problem.
John, I love the work you do, and the humanizing point is really good. And I will put in the show notes some links, some of the ads you've done, which have been fantastic and always employ humor and connection and sort of help people see the issue in a different way. I just want to ask also, you said there about a campaign that reframes it, talks about polluters and how do we think about this differently. But I want to ask specifically about, at this moment, actually, the most effective campaign is being run against people who are trying to do something about climate change. We've talked a lot on this podcast about the anti-ESG movement, about this attempt to slow down what financial institutions are doing, the insurers and others. And so quickly, it seems, they've been able to throw uncertainty and confusion in a manner that appears to be unraveling a significant amount of work by loads of people over decades to actually get momentum here. So the question is, from a communications perspective, how did that happen? How were they able to do that so quickly? And secondly, what should we now do about it? Do we have a responsibility to reclaim the narrative? And if so, how do we do that?
Well, it's a really good question. I think the first lesson I would get is that this is a narrative war more than anything else. And it does seem to work. And I will say that the brand woke capitalism is an effective brand. It connotes an idea simply and quickly. And that idea, when people hear it, will be, oh, politics is dominating my investment concerns, which people don't want. And so the brand achieves a goal fairly effectively. The good news is there are narratives that beat it, hands down. We just have to start using those narratives. And I think that the temptation is to get stuck in the complexity of it. Less than 30% of people have even heard of ESG. And so the ESG defense campaign is a proposition for elites. It's not a proposition for regular people. So what do people care about? People care about the cost of extreme weather events. They care about their pension fund under risk. They don't want the government running their money. And so there is a counter narrative for that, which is really effective. It turns out from our research, the thing that seems to work the best is equating climate change with materiality and saying we can't obscure the data that actually quantifies the risk around climate, and we need the freedom to invest. And we have limitations on using the data that's associated with environmental risk. And those limitations actually cost everyone. They cost the taxpayer. They cost the pension holder.
I totally agree with you that there's something insane about the ESG thing. It's like censorship. I really didn't think the US was the land of censorship. Although I did want to pick something up with you. I was watching a little bit of Fox News, as I often do, actually just last night, and there was a little segment about the wildfires, and the terrible smoke and the haze in New York. Well, you might have thought that was to do with climate change. Turns out it's not, because they interviewed somebody called Daniel Turner from Power the Future, which would appear to be a pro-fossil fuel lobbying group. And straight to the camera, both the interviewer and the person being interviewed, who seemed to agree with each other in a spectacular amount. They said that when we use fossil fuels to the fullest, we manage our forests, and fossil fuels are the solution, and it will also help with world hunger, and we need less bad advice from the green crowd. Now, I've sent the link to that to put in the show notes if anybody listening to this program would like to watch a particularly deranged segment of television. But, you can't say on TV that the Holocaust didn't happen. You can't say on TV that cigarettes are good for your health. Why can you say this on TV?
I mean, the good news is that the truth beats the lies by an order of magnitude. Most people are inclined to believe and do make the associations between climate change and these extreme weather events. And so a message spoken by our side will crush that ridiculous message that you just said. So part of the answer is we got to get in the game. We've got to get in the game. At the moment things happen, we need to be ahead of the game when we know. I mean, this is the sad truth. The outrage part of the truth is we know that there are 15 or 20 things that get people's attention when it's associated with climate change. We know there are a set of extreme weather events that are going to happen. We know what they are. We can be ready for those. We should have our messages ready at the right time, because our messages beat their messages by an order of magnitude. But we just need to put more investment into getting the right people in the right places at the right times. I'm not as worried about disinformation as I am worried about underinvestment in educating people, because educating people is relatively cheap and very effective. We had a 25% increase in suburban women who are growth, 25% growth in suburban women who care about climate change from communicating to them. And so it's not that they've got an effective message, is that we have a message we need to say more. We've got to awaken 8 billion people on the planet to this thing that's happening. If we don't invest in that, we got a big sleepwalking problem. And right now, less than 20% of people think clean energy has gotten cheaper over the last decade. Okay. Solar has gone down by 90 percentage points. And so we don't have a message problem as much as a communications gap. How could that be that people don't realize? And many people still think clean energy as an expensive luxury, when in fact the truth is that it's plummeting in costs and it's one of the least expensive sources of energy we have. So we have a message dissemination opportunity in front of us that we really need to take advantage of. And we know, like, one of the things that we've learned is there are a few moments in the course of a year where people are really going to care about climate change. There is a hurricane brewing off the Cape Verdes right now in June, which looks like it has a 70% chance of turning into a real storm. We need to be prepared for when that happens, to have all of our spokespeople lined up in order to get our message across so we're not subject to the disinformation.
What you've just said there is really fascinating, which is we spend a lot of time thinking about what's the right message and how do we persuade people. Actually, we've got the messages, but the reality is that fossil fuel companies are spending an enormous amount of money to protect their current investments, and we're not matching that in terms of our investment to get our message out. It's as simple as that.
No, that's exactly right. And we've been running this data machine for the last few years, and we've now served and measured about 2.5 billion ads. So we're starting to learn, what does it cost to actually turn someone into a climate supporter? And it's not that expensive. People want to do something about the issue.
What does it cost out of interest?
From 13 reads that we've done, 13 large scale experiments, the average has been $12.70 per person. But our last read was $6.80. So it seems to be getting cheaper. Maybe we've gotten to a point where people are starting to remember the message. You have some decay on that message. But if you think about what the stakes are, there's a pretty high ROI to communicating, educating on climate change. It's a pretty high ROI. It's reasonably inexpensive rather.
John, does that data come from US or is that global? Those $12 or $6?
It would be that is US data, but it'll be similar. It'll probably be a lot cheaper in parts of the global south where media is cheaper, but it'll be similar, I think, in other countries, just based on how we can correlate research tests and in-market tests to a high degree. So I think it would be a similar cost in other countries.
So we have the facts. We know what the messages are. It's cheap to educate. We're just not darn prepared.
So $6 each, maybe 5 billion people, $30 billion. Come on, philanthropists, whoever's listening.
It's about the size of the video game market.
Yeah, in the context of the benefit we gain,
Yeah, but we don't need to educate 8 billion, right? Let's remember that.
That's why I kind of went for 5, sort of half. Yeah.
Let's just do the US. That's 2 billion that's like, what is that? That 2% of the cash Google or Apple have got on hand.
It's to your point about the last couple of decades, Christian, at the beginning. I do think that we haven't necessarily taken a marketing mentality to the problem. And so what do marketers do? They start with a customer and then they design the product. And so, if you want to create double stuffed Oreos or whatever, you go out and you figure out what does someone care about? What's their identity? What motivates them? What do they love? What do they fear? And then you figure out, how do you package what you have to say in order to engage them and add value to their lives? Communications has been at the tail end of the climate movement for a long time. And we get to a point in time, it was like, oh, that's hard to sell. So I have a big piece of research coming out in a month or so called Nice Policy, Can You Sell It? Which is a big study in the globe, in the G20 as to what can you actually sell? And I think we're learning this over time. It's been hard to sell a carbon tax. It's really hard to sell a carbon tax to conservatives because it's climate change tax and universal basic income potentially rolled into one. It's really important that we start with the audience and figure out, how do we position our policy solutions in a way that they can accept and not get it positioned for us. There's a reason that 20 states in the US have bans on gas bans, right? Because if it gets positioned as a ban, that's a tricky positioning. And so positioning things as upgrades over bans, or advantageous versus costly, inexpensive versus expensive, we need to sort of think about that before we go so far down the policy path that we don't end up being able to sell things that we need to do.
Yeah, I was just speaking the other day at a seminar for an NGO with the former Environment Minister of Canada, Catherine McKenna, and I said, "Oh, you got a carbon tax in?" And she kind of jumped through the screen and said, "It's not a carbon tax. The Supreme Court have made clear it's not a carbon tax. It's a price on pollution." And she also talked about how they went through the testing, just as you have done. And we can't compliment you enough for doing that kind of research and acknowledging that people have a big problem with the tax, but should you be allowed to pollute for free? No. Should there be a price on pollution? Yes. And then the idea that the tax is entirely neutral, so it doesn't stay with the government; it gets paid straight out to people in a check. And each year, the amount of money going back to the public from the pollution the price on pollution is increasing. The reason I ask this is I just wondered if you had a general a bit of advice for the sort of aspiring policymakers who listen to this podcast all over the world, who may be in political parties or their advisors. How do you think, what's the secret sauce for developing climate policy?
Well, I think that there's a explain it to your neighbor test that everyone should go through as one thing to think about. We did a poll where we asked citizens across the globe, what's the UN target for an acceptable degree of warming? We talk about 1.5 degrees a lot. You know, the answer to that question is across 8 countries, 4 degrees centigrade. Okay. And so I just think there's a lot of, like, a piece of advice. Number one is burst your bubble, look at what you're saying, think about how you're relating, talk to your neighbor. 1.5 is a very small number. So is 4, but no, it's not. It's catastrophe. And get human about it. And then, you know, I think the Secretary General has done a good job on this, by the way. I think that language is human and real, and it's about accountability and things that are happening now. But we got to get out of the 2040. By the way, the same number of people think we should get to net zero by 2040 as 2050. That's interesting. That doesn't mean anything to people. They don't think about it. So we got to get out of the 1.5 and the decarbonization and the 2040, and we've got to get into people like me are being affected. Okay, who are those groups of people, and what do they care about? Everybody's got a reason to care, and policymakers have got to connect to that more, which is tricky because it's a big conceptual challenge and it requires a lot of big brains to be able to tackle. But we need to make it way simpler.
John, this may be an unfair question, but can you crystallize your wisdom and experience that you've been gathering into, I don't know, 1 sentence, 2 sentences, 3 words? If I am trying to communicate on climate change, what is your top suggestion to me?
Well, we've said simplicity, humanity, and accountability. Keep it simple, make it about humans, and make it being able to identify the source of the problem and communicate that right away. I think the other piece of advice that I often give is test yourself, that whenever you say the phrase climate change, put a consequence of that within 6 words. The climate change that is causing extreme fires, the climate change that is raising people's food prices, the climate changes that are causing your air conditioning bills to be unacceptable, the climate change that caused extreme flooding in Pakistan. Like, make it a consequence, because the second part's relevant, the first part isn't. And so because we called it climate change instead of something much better like the pollution blanket or something like that, because we did that, we got to live with that. But we got to surround it with an actual consequence that people are feeling, so that they're fighting the consequences. They're not necessarily fighting this bigger and more amorphous concept called climate change.
Well, I'm going to do a search on all of my writings and speeches and everything. That was very helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a negative of in advertising, people would say features, not benefits. So you say, rather than saying this car has an air conditioner, you'd say keep cool in this new car. So the same thing applies in reverse, rather than sort of saying, there's climate change. You say there's climate change and it's, But John, did you say, just last little prompt that I picked up from your TED Talk, that in Florida, if you say to people, do you want to reach net zero? They say no. And if you say to people in Florida, do you want to do something about the flooding? They say yes. Is that right?
Yeah, quite specifically, we tested it. We tried to get people to sign petitions, and it's 5 times more expensive if you say, let's get to net zero by 2040, than it is to simply say, let's save Florida. 5 times more expensive. So I'll get 5 times more people to act on climate change if I talk about saving Florida than I talk about getting to net zero. So that's, I guess, Christiana, that would be my one piece of advice, is do that. Like, talk
Be
about
practical. Yeah. Amazing. John, thank you so much. It's been so insightful as ever. I always love talking to you and learning about these things. And thanks for coming on and speaking to our listeners. Before we let you go, we've got to ask you, someone who sees the world and understands what's coming in a whole variety of ways that are sort of hidden to many of us. Can you please give us something you're outraged by and something you're optimistic about?
Well, I'm outraged by the thing you brought up, which was this attack on ESG. I think that caught the movement by surprise and had a big impact, and does sort of reinforce the idea that narrative matters, because it's a narrative that caught on fairly quickly. I'm optimistic that, well, first of all, we made a ton of progress, but we can market that progress, and marketing works. So let's market our wins. This is a lot to say. So I'm optimistic that we've got some. If the problem statement is we're trying to convince people we're making progress on it, in marketing you have a thing called the RTB, reason to believe. And so In 2023, we have a lot more RTBs than we had in 2022, and every year goes by. So let's market the heck out of those, and I think we'll get there.
Love that. Yeah. RTBs.
Marketing works.
It does.
People spend $600 billion a year because they believe in that point, and I think they're right.
John, thank you so much. Really, thank you. Thank you for that, and thank you for continuing this. You've been working. You say you've only started your company 4 years ago, but actually, that's just the format because you've been at this for such a long time. So thank you for staying over this for such a long time, and thank you for continuing to support all of us twits who think we're communicating and are actually not.
It's great to be with you all. Love the podcast. Great time together. Thank you all so much.
So I always feel I learned so much talking to John Marshall. He just understands, I think, in such a fascinatingly cold commercial way, how do you sell something to someone? And that's just not how we've thought about this issue. We've sort of said, you should believe because it's important, or you should understand. And of course, it's been a real struggle. And I think we can learn a lot from him. What did you both take from that?
I'm just astounded at the simplicity of his message.
Money.
This is not rocket science. No, it's not even money. It's not rocket science. It's standing back from the belief that data and complicated words are going to make a difference. And just the simplicity and the impact of just cold marketing. We almost, in the climate movement, I actually dare think that in the past, hopefully we're getting over it, we're stood back from marketing because it's sort of tainted and, maybe
It's how we got here. It's icky.
Yeah, it's icky. We're too good for marketing. We're too righteous.
Right.
We
too
know
pure.
we're
Yeah.
on the right. We're on the right side of history. And maybe it's, maybe it's as simple as basic marketing.
Yes, and Tom did mention money. That a lot of the secret of good marketing is very expensive, creative people coming up with very brilliant plans, increasingly digitally deployed now. Things have changed. And also to be able to buy or have that media somehow. So I actually wonder if there's a role for the leading brands in the world to start being the agents of these messages. Why wouldn't major brands want to communicate some of the messages of the climate movement to show that they're part of the solution and not part of the problem? And actually, if we can tap into those major global budgets and that reach, then we might find ourselves very quickly changing the public mood. And that is, I guess, the crux of the whole war.
You'll both remember this, I won't say who, but about a year or more ago, we met a very famous person somewhere, and that person posted about our podcast and had more than 100 million subscribers, and it made no difference to our download numbers. And that's when I really realized the intersection of money with communication in social media and elsewhere. These things only appear in people's feeds. They're only promoted in a manner that leads to an outcome if money is put behind them. And we've been thinking that we can go on Twitter with our thousands of followers and put stuff out and change the conversation. It's just not working. Actually, there are those entities who are putting real money into protecting their vested interest. And as you taught me many years ago, Paul, no one is investing to protect future revenue streams that they don't currently have. So there's a massive gap from those who are prepared to actually invest in changing people's minds to bring about the regulations and the industries of tomorrow. And as you say, Christian, it's incredibly simple. We just haven't done that work. And even today, philanthropies don't really understand that they need to do this. There's still a desire to focus on like crunchy nuts and bolts things. Comms is a bit woolly. Actually, what John showed us is it's not. You can work out how many dollars you have to invest to persuade a person to do something different and to believe in something different and to find the narrative that works. We need to do this really urgently at a scale we've never done it before if we're going to make the progress we need to.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we can get people to believe something into existence. And John is showing exactly how. Fascinating interview.
Okay. Lovely to see you both.
Yeah, lovely to see you too, Tom.
Hazel May with Golden Chains is this week's song. Thanks for joining us, and we will maybe be together in person, or maybe some of us will be next week. But anyway, we look forward to engaging with you and talking to you listeners next week. Thanks for joining us. Bye.
Bye.
Hello, Outrage and Optimism. My name is Hazel May, and I'm a finalist in the Environmental Music Prize. I wrote my song Golden Chains as a bit of an angsty climate anthem. It was originally a poem written on a day where I was feeling pretty low. I really was searching for hope at the time in a world where I noticed most people in power were choosing profit over conservation. Let's be real, it can still feel this way. And also, there are so many people fighting back and coming together to advocate for change. And that's pretty amazing. When I think of outrage, I think of people who purposefully bring harm to others. Whether that be through their words or actions, it's just never cool. In saying that, I am truly optimistic about how much kindness and empathy I see every day, and I'm so excited to see what positive change people can continue to bring into this world.
It's a flood of information. We're reading all the signs. The stillness turns to flow away. Fire fills our eyes. But all they do is bury our future in their hands. 'Cause all they want is growing, the money they can spend. You're looking for is disaster. We're running out of time. Still haven't learned to master a caring humankind. But there is still some years left, as brief as they may be. This paradise we're spending still has a heartbeat. Crying over lies of golden rains. Maybe we will die